With me to explain Israel's reasons for taking this course of action is the spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister, Tal Heinrich. Tal, thanks for making the time. By all accounts, this latest push, military push into Rafah now, has blocked off the only artery. The UN is calling it like choking off the main arteries for humanitarian aid for people in Rafah already in a very desperate situation. What is Israel doing to make sure it protects the innocent civilians in all of this?
First, I can tell you that aid is still going into Gaza from the northern border crossing, the Erez border crossing, and other routes, also aid being airdropped. But let's break down exactly what's at stake and what's happening and why the Kerem Shalom border crossing, the one from which much of the humanitarian aid was funneling into Gaza, we're talking about hundreds of trucks daily, is right now, as I'm hearing, at the moment, not operational. This is where Hamas actually fired earlier today, that they fired mortars at that Kerem Shalom border crossing. That's the second time they've been doing it this week. They also fired rockets fired at a humanitarian aid corridor that was transporting aid from the south to the north. So Hamas, well, they're doing everything possible on their end to try to increase the civilian suffering in Gaza. And they're not just stealing the aid to feed their own war machine, so to say, or to send, to sell the food and the aid for tenfold the price at the markets. They're doing it specifically because this is their strategy. They want to create a crisis in Gaza. They want the civilians in Gaza to suffer so that Israel will take the fire for their own actions. And they hope that by leveraging it this way, the world will put enough pressure on Israel that would make Israel stop the war before achieving its war objectives and would let Hamas live another day. That's their strategy here. So,
Tal, I understand, obviously, the Israel's perspective on all of this and what you've been saying, but essentially, the situation is already still being described as pretty much a full-blown famine. So it's, there has to be something that can be done in order to allow the people, the ones who are caught in all of this, to be able to find somewhere. Israel's telling them to move from that area in order to take action, but where is there for them to go?
So a few things to break down here. First, there's not a full-blown famine in Gaza. I've seen these reports coming from, I don't know, the various people who hate Israel and are not aware of what's really happening on the ground. There are enough calories per capita per day entering Gaza. That has been the case over the past months and weeks. In fact, I can tell you that, Riz, that specifically in the northern part of Gaza, we've heard from several international organizations who've been working with us that we should reduce the amount of aid because it exceeded the population. So there was more aid in recent days going into northern Gaza, more than 100 trucks, and that was more than what was needed, and they didn't want the aid to perish. So they told us, they asked us even to reduce it. There are hundreds of trucks entering daily. Since I'll just give you some numbers. Since October 7th, more than 500,000 tons of international aid, humanitarian aid, came in. We're talking about nearly 400,000 tons of food alone. There's more food entering Gaza now in recent days, in recent weeks, than what was the case before the war. That's a fact. Hamas wants to create this image of a humanitarian crisis to create a false narrative of famine, and that's not the reality. That's not the reality on the ground.
But Tal, irrespective of what you believe Hamas's motives might be, these warnings of famine and these descriptions of the situation, they actually come from international agencies, including the United Nations. Why would they have a reason to hate Israel, as you put it?
I think, well, the United Nations is known for its bias against Israel. But again, the UN hasn't been doing its job, Riz, since the beginning of the war in what pertains to the distribution of humanitarian aid in Gaza. We've had several days throughout the war in which the contents of more than 700 aid trucks were waiting on the Gazan side of the Kerem Shalom border crossing, waiting to be distributed by UN organizations. This is why Israel has increased its cooperation with other international organizations who managed to do a much better job. I didn't address, though, your second question about the evacuation from Rafah, right?
Yes, that's correct.
That
yeah.
was so. Yeah, I wanted to reach to address everything that you brought up. So we're operating in Rafah very precisely right now, and it's not that we're operating in the entire city of Rafah. We're talking about a specific operation at the moment that's happening, from what I can share, of course, in the eastern part of the city. And why? Because we had precise intelligence that this is where terror infrastructure is located. We had precise intelligence that some parts of the eastern part of the city were being used for terrorist purposes. And the latest update that I have for you is that our troops or forces have taken operational control of the Gazan side of the Rafah crossing. That's the latest. Now, as we operate in these areas, we also urge the civilians in the specific locations to evacuate to other specific locations, humanitarian zones, and we put out a map for them. It's numbered, it's divided to zones. It is very, very clear, and we've called on them hours, if not days in advance, to evacuate to the specific locations where we have expanded humanitarian zones. If it's the Al Mawasi area, for instance, where we increase the sheltering equipment, the food, field hospitals have been set up, and we really urge the civilians there to evacuate. Our directives, they saved lives.
My question is also, though, why have this action now, just as it seemed that Hamas was ready to agree to ceasefire terms?
So Hamas has not agreed to ceasefire terms. Our war cabinet has took a decision, a unanimous decision, to continue to operate in Rafah in order to exert more pressure on Hamas, more military pressure on Hamas to achieve all of the war objectives, which are to bring the 132 hostages back home, to break Hamas as a governing body and a military wing, and of course to make sure that Gaza will never pose a terror threat to us again. All along, as you know, we've been also pursuing the diplomatic avenue to try to yield another framework like the one that we saw back in November that led to the release of more than 100 hostages. We want all of our stolen people out of Gaza, and we want it now. But every offer, including the latest offer that we put on the table, the one that, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken deemed as very, very generous, was rejected by Hamas. And then, Reese, Hamas tried to play a cheap PR trick that unfortunately many in the international community and even in world media fell for it. They bought into their lies. They said, we agreed to a ceasefire deal. But what did they agree to? A deal that wasn't even on the table. It's like me telling you right now, Riz, you know what? I agree to be appointed as the next Secretary General of the United Nations.
What are you saying to the hostages' families now? It seems that protest level has really increased in Israel.
So we hug the hostages' families. We are committed to the principle that nobody will be left behind. And we will continue to do whatever it takes to try to bring each and every one of them home. We know that the only thing that works against Hamas is this combination of military pressure and the diplomatic action.
Are they listening? Because it seems they're out on the streets more than ever in Israel.
So, there are protests right now, of course, but it's not reflective of the entire Israeli public. Hostage families, they have different opinions. Some hostage families think one way, some think another way, and every opinion is legitimate. Every opinion is an opinion that we listen to. We accept it. But of course, we try to bring everyone home, and everyone has an idea, obviously, of what the strategy should be, what the war should be like.
There is a view, though, that if there is a ceasefire, it's essentially the end of Benjamin Netanyahu when it comes to his coalition partners who want much harder action. But if he doesn't accept the ceasefire, it's end of him politically when it comes to the international community, who are not, it seems, including the US, too happy with his direction.
This is not about politics, not for the prime minister and not for anyone else right now. There are very few people who are actually dealing with politics right now in my country. And the reason is, because when Hamas targeted us on October 7th, they didn't care who voted for who. So we are united right now inner support of these war objectives as the cabinet defined them on October 7th, and they haven't changed since then. We are committed to the principle of bringing each and every person home. Our stolen people must come back home. And in fact, yes, Hamas tried to play this cheap trick on us, but the recent days have proven that the military pressure and the military threat on Hamas are actually working because, when did they start playing these tricks? After we said that we'll advance on Rafah.
Okay.
When did they start releasing more videos of hostages? When we said that we'll advance on Rafah. But we are still, having said that, we are still trying to pursue the diplomatic avenue. And this is why we sent a delegation and we're still talking to mediators.
So, Tal, we're short on time, so I want to ask you what you make of the massive growth, it seems, across the world in terms of international protests, student-led mostly. But it seems to indicate that there is a massive movement against Israel's policies in Gaza.
So I'm speaking to you from the United States and specifically from New York. And we've seen here in this city massive protests that, in our opinion, should not be labeled by the media as pro-Palestinian protests. These are clear anti-Israel and anti-Semitic protests. Because listen to what these people say. They're not calling for, it's not the ceasefire crowd. What they're actually calling for practically is more Jewish and more Israeli blood, because if they cared about Palestinian lives, if they wanted to bring an end to the war, these protesters would have called on Hamas to surrender and release the hostages. But they're not doing it.
Just quickly, that suggests that there is a massive anti-Semitic youth movement out there. Surely it can't be the case.
It's a combination of things. And sometimes these people don't know that they're anti-Semitic because the IRA definition of anti-Semitism is pretty wide. Holding Jews or the Jewish state to a different standard than any other nation and any other population group is also defined as anti-Semitism. And this is by part what they're doing.
Well, we can have a chat, I hope, in the future about the way things are going, especially now as it seems to be growing in the US. But Tal Heinrich, I thank you for your time now.
My pleasure. Thank you, Riz.